Member for Brantford-Brant.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's always a privilege to rise in this House on behalf of the residents of Brantford-Brant. The budget released by this out-of-touch government, blindly supported by the NDP, fails to address the #1 issue to my constituents and to many Canadians, namely the cost of living crisis. This costly coalition is solely responsible for the financial uncertainties Canadian families have been facing for the last 8 years. For the last 8 years, Conservatives and Canadians have been calling out the Prime Minister's inflationary taxes and spending as they continue to hurt the hardworking people of this country most. Our leader, with the support of the entire Conservative caucus, demanded that this budget had to work for the people who work for this country. We had 3 clear demands: end the inflationary deficits and spending, lower taxes and scrap the carbon tax, remove government gatekeepers to free up land and speed up building permits so people can once again afford housing in this country. Unsurprisingly, this budget fails to fulfill any of these demands. Instead, it brings an extra $43 billion of new inflation, debt, and taxes. This is what this Prime Minister delivers year after year: debt, inflation, and more costs on the backs of hardworking Canadians. Last year, the Deputy Prime Minister pledged that the debt-to-GDP ratio would decline and deficits would be reduced. She said, quote, "This is our fiscal anchor. This is a line we shall not cross. It will ensure that our finances remain sustainable," end of quote. A year later, her boss and the entire Liberal team definitely crossed that line numerous times. Madam Speaker, I will discuss specifically how this budget fails to address the cost of living crisis hurting Canadian families, how the coalition focuses more on flushing the pockets of taxpayers and punishing workers, and what the next Conservative government will do differently. To begin, on April the 1st, the Liberal carbon tax increased to 14 cents per litre, making it more expensive for Canadians to heat their homes and get to work. Despite the years of the Liberals claiming that 80% of households who are paying the carbon tax would end up with more money in their pockets, the PBO officer confirmed what we Conservatives have been saying all along, that the carbon tax will actually put Canadians in a worse financial position. As outlined by the PBO, the carbon tax will cost the average family between $400 and $847 in 2023, even after the rebates. The carbon tax is not an environmental plan. It's never been an environmental plan. It's a costly tax plan that is damaging to families, especially those on fixed income and those who live in rural areas. In fact, this government has failed to hit any of its emission targets. StatsCan recently reported that grocery prices are rising at the fastest rate in 40 years. Almost a quarter of Canadians have had to cut back on the food they buy to keep up with rising grocery prices, and 20% of families are skipping meals to cope with rising food costs. As this government knows, last summer was the worst for Canadian food banks in 40 years, as they recorded 1.5 million visits in just 1 month. That's a 55% increase over 2019, and it's projected to be greater this year. Working Canadians need and deserve concrete and fiscally responsible changes. This all talk and no action approach taken by this Prime Minister is failing Canadians. Canadians are the ones paying for this government's agenda. And what are they offering in return through this budget? A grocery rebate, which in reality is nothing more than an enhanced GST credit of anywhere from $200 to $500, which shockingly will not be made available until July of this year. Wow. This works out to approximately $3.85 to $9.61 a week. This government is making a mockery of the cost of living crisis by suggesting that this credit will make a tangible difference in the lives of Canadians. This is not even enough to cover the cost of milk and cereal for children in a given week. Additionally, the 2023 Canada's Food Price Report predicts that a family of 4 will spend over $1,000 more on food this year, almost $600 more than the $467 rebate that they will receive. This so-called rebate does not even come close to covering the rising cost of food that the Liberal deficits and tax hikes have caused. It permits, however, the rising cost of living as the price of food is expected to increase an additional 5 to 7% by the end of the year. Madam Speaker, this budget contains no new policies to increase the supply of Canadian housing, even as record-high immigration places unprecedented stresses on home and rental prices. The reality is that home prices have doubled since this tax and spend Prime Minister took office in 2015. 35-year-olds have no choice but to live in their parents' basements as they are unable to buy a home and start a family. According to Bloomberg, Canada has the second most inflating housing bubble in the world. Monthly payments on mortgages are rising even as house prices are dropping. We have the second most available land in the world, yet Vancouver and Toronto are the world's third and 10th most overpriced housing markets. To put that into perspective, renters in Toronto can now expect to pay over $2,300 per month for a one-bedroom apartment. The government housing benefit of a one-time payment of $500 was nothing more than a small band-aid to a serious crisis. To greater emphasize this point, as reported today by the Canadian press, only 44% of those who would have likely been eligible for the one-time top-up of the housing benefit actually received it, while just over one-half have received the Canadian dental benefit. Unbelievable, inexcusable competence. Madam Speaker, the expenses of this government are driving up the cost of living. This Prime Minister's legacy stands as the one who has doubled Canada's deficit, adding more debt than all Canadian Prime Ministers combined. Inflation is at a 40-year high. Canadian homeowners experienced 8 consecutive interest rate hikes at the fastest rate in decades. Families that bought a modest home 5 years ago with an affordable mortgage that is now up for renewal will pay $7,000 more a year. As per the former chief economic analyst of StatsCan, the government's budget is working against the Bank of Canada's policy to reduce inflation by failing to control spending. The Prime Minister who believed that the budget would balance itself, who claimed he wasn't interested in monetary policy, and who took on debt so people wouldn't have to, is now advising with a serious face that Canadians should be fine with using their credit cards to pay for tuition and home renovations. CTV News reported that more and more Canadians are resorting to debt to pay bills amid high inflation. Not to mention the average increase in debt payment due to higher interest rates is another $2,000. And despite the Liberal political narrative, it's been revealed that 40% of all new spending measures had nothing to do with COVID. That's an astonishing $205 billion. Madam Speaker, despite this abysmal track record, it's important for Canadians to know that not all hope is lost. A Conservative government will turn the financial situation in this country around. To be specific, a Conservative government will create more cash flow by creating more of what cash buys. We will produce more food, gas, and other resources here in Canada. We'll remove government gatekeepers by building more homes and making Canada the quickest place in the world to get a building permit. We will make energy more affordable. The next Conservative government will repeal anti-energy laws and get Canadian energy out into the world market. We'll cut corporate welfare and scrap the carbon tax while simultaneously tackling climate change by making alternative energy cheaper instead of making everything else more expensive. We will reform the tax and benefit system, making sure that Canadians are rewarded for their work by putting that hard-earned dollar from picking up an extra shift in their pocket, not the government's. We will be a government that will restore hope. We will rekindle the belief that people's paychecks and savings can buy them a decent life. We will make fiscally responsible decisions to create an affordable life for Canadians. We will restore Canada's promise in a country where it doesn't matter who you are, a country where everyone has the ability to achieve their goals. I will continue, Madam Speaker, to stand for the interests of my constituents and fight for all working Canadians, and will not be supporting this inflationary budget bill. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable